Welcome to the fifth of this series on God and science. And last time we talked about self-organization, and today we're going to be talking about interconnectedness. So fasten your seatbelts. So some questions to think about. I talked about the idea that from science, from Seth Lloyd, who said that the universe is like a gigantic quantum computer, and what is it seeking to compute? And his conclusion was itself. And what the mystics say, in particular the Sufis, say that God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, seeking to know him, herself. So there's a question that might arise of what drives there to be a desire to be greater wisdom. And we can think about this desire as being present from both sides, from the divine side, the divine seeking to know him, herself, in a way that only can be known through manifestation. And on the manifest side, narrowing it down to each of us as an individual soul, each of us is on a spiritual journey because we have a desire to know more of what the universe is all about, and however we think of God or the totality and so on. So there's a twofold desire of each side seeking to know more of itself. So something that came to me in a meditation some time ago is related to Sophia, which is the archetypal figure of wisdom. And I think I mentioned this before. In Proverbs, there's a passage that said when God was going to bring about the creation, wisdom was there with him, and wisdom is thought to be this being of Sophia. So what came to me in my meditation was on the God side of things, and we're anthropomorphizing a bit here, but you could think of God sitting there going, well, I want to know myself. But on the Sophia side of things, it seemed to me there was what I call an eliciting light. There was something that drew forth that desire from the divine being. And it was both sides together that resulted in the creation. And I also mentioned this before too. In the Old Testament, in Genesis, the Hebrew term that's used for the God that created the heaven and the earth is Elohim, which means we, or Father, Mother God. But what happened over the years and centuries is it got masculinized to Yahweh, or Jehovah, and just the masculine side, and the feminine side, until I would say fairly recently, has really been on the wayside of things. Okay, so now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something called presence. So what does presence mean? Well, you all are physically present right here, and hopefully you're mentally present too. You seem to be pretty awake and everything. So there's different ways that we can be present to something. We can be physically present. We can be tuned in to just the input of our physical senses. We can be mentally present, our thoughts in response to what we're experiencing. We can be emotionally present, and we can be spiritually present. And it's only when we have a combination of all of these going on that we can say that we're fully present to what we're experiencing. So those of you that have been to the previous classes, I've talked about what happens when there's a linkage with the subtle realms and the manifest realms. And what happens is there's an opening up of what's called the space of possibilities. And actually the ordinary laws of physics are different once there's a linkage with the subtle energy. Instead of entropy or disorder increases. What actually happens is the disorder decreases, there's more information available. So let's kind of put this all in the mix here. So what happens when we are fully present in our spiritual work, and also with our eyes open, walking around the world, which is also our spiritual work, we actually are helping to bring about this linkage of a deeper level of ourselves and the reality that we dwell in with the, quote, ordinary reality, and we're actually opening up a space and more possibilities to take place. So being fully present enables this linkage between the subtle and the manifest, and it helps to create a space of new possibilities. And what happens then there's a circulation of light, and you could also say there's a circulation of information. There's a transformation of the information that comes down from the transcendent dimension, and it's changed by our experiences in the world, and then it's returned. And in the Kabbalah, this is called the returning light. And there's this very interesting description in the Kabbalah talking about partaking of the bread of shame. And what is the bread of shame? The bread of shame means that someone, having become capable of they've awakened enough to allow this circulation of light to help to fulfill not only their individual soul's purpose, but the divine purpose for an increase in the overall wisdom. Someone who's capable of that but doesn't send the light back but just wants to kind of hold on to it, they're actually partaking in the bread of shame because they're actually going against the reason for their being and existence. So we could say that by allowing ourselves as much as we're able to be fully present to whatever it is that we're experiencing, we're helping to fulfill not only our divine purpose, but the divine purpose for there to be an existence in the first place. So let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions about that, because this is kind of laying the framework for what I want to get into today. Yes?
And the divine purpose for creation is to expand wisdom? Is to what, add to the information available?
Well, that's how I look at it. I mean, that's one way that you could look at it. You could say if the purpose was for God to more fully know Him, herself, and that can only take place through the beings in all the realms of manifestation, and if you believe there's no end of what can be known. I mentioned Ibn Arabi, this great Sufi mystic from hundreds of years ago, saying that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no one else has access to, and it's not like something that's carved in stone already waiting to be discovered. It's something that emerges through that soul's unique experiences in life. And so if you believe that there's no end to what can be known, which means there's no end to what God can know of Him, herself, which means that God is not a static God that's just sitting in this archetypal perfected state and there's no change in it. And I'm going to be getting into some interesting things from physics talking about this too, about that we really live in an evolutionary universe, and it's theorized that we're part of a multiverse of untold numbers of universes, but there's I love this term I just came across in this wonderful book called The Self-Actualizing Cosmos by Ervin Laszlo, and he calls it trans-universe inheritance, that we are the partakers of an inheritance that comes from every universe that's ever been before this universe. And the original theory of the Big Bang was, well, you know, there was just somehow this Big Bang and here's our universe, and that's pretty much enough mystery to deal with. But now the cosmologists, many of them believe that this was just a part of a inconceivably vaster cycle of evolution of different universes. Okay. So we're actually helping to further this increase in wisdom. And wisdom just doesn't mean a list of facts that you've acquired. It doesn't mean Wikipedia becomes bigger. Of course, you can't always believe what's in Wikipedia either, much less WikiLeaks, but anyway. But there's no end to it. And to me, if there were the possibility of there being an end to what could possibly be known, it would be a very boring reality. Even if it's a vast amount, it's much bigger than the Library of Congress. Well, once you've got it all, now what are you going to do forever? Yes.
So then, and I think this is evident, of course, for what that does, then is kind of poke the ideas of the omnis in our kind of church doctrine in a kind of powerful way. The omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. Those are kind of the three big omnis, and there's probably others as well. That there's less of the omniscience and more of the unfolding or increasing in knowledge.
Yes, and
that's
it's
a pretty powerful shift.
yeah. And if I could coin a term which I just thought of, maybe we could, for those three, substitute omni-evolving or omni-emerging. In the traditional way of thinking about God, God is generally something separated from existence, from manifestation. And here we are trying to get back to where we came from. And in the previous classes I've talked about the notions in Hinduism of the cycles of creation and preservation and destruction. And traditionally it's thought, well, it just all gets wiped out, it's the play of God, and it just starts over from scratch. Well, there's evidence from science and my own experiences, I believe, from meditation and many contemporary mystical ways of looking at things, that it doesn't start over from scratch, that there's always the seeding, even if universes get destroyed, which they probably do. Our physical universe, eventually all the protons are going to decay and the universe is going to expand forever and there won't be any light or anything. But the essence of what's gained from all that is going to become the seed of some future universe. And this is a cosmological explanation about why the constants in physics are so precise, I mean to 14 decimal places, that if they were changed, some of them in the 14th decimal place, there'd be no possibility of life. And the chances statistically of these just being some random combination of things and after the Big Bang it just happened to be this way are vanishingly small. I mean, it's just, to me, it's an impossibility. But a much more, and other explanations are, well, there's intelligent design and so on. But just the pure science explanation is there's an evolution, a natural evolutionary process in the multiverse, and what worked in previous universes that enables life and self-awareness to increase, and my add-on to this, wisdom to increase, becomes the basis for the next creation. And so what we have in this universe, in all likelihood, is the result of who knows how many other universes that maybe sort of worked or didn't work so well, but this is working better here. And when our universe fades away, the next one will probably have all the information from this. And there's some evidence and some theories in physicists and cosmologists that what they call the constants in physics are not necessarily constant. They may be changing over a very gradual period of time, so it's very difficult to measure. And this is really so different from the, I went to Caltech my freshman year. I mean, this heavy-duty science place, and what was considered dogma back then, I mean, a lot of that is totally different now. It's changed because good scientists are open to looking at the evidence of research and realizing, well, this is what we thought things were, but maybe not. And that's the excitement that fuels a lot of scientists. So, interconnectedness. I want to talk about an experiment that was done by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I mentioned before something called the two-slit experiment. It's a basic experiment in quantum physics, but it's still mind-boggling. So you have a machine that sends out photons one at a time through one slit, and you have a screen on the other side. And what you get is the dispersal of light like you'd have shining a flashlight. You've got just like a circle where the photons hit. If you have two slits, even though you're only putting the photon through the one, let's say, on the right, there's an interference pattern. You get bands of light and dark, and it's as if the photon went through both slits and it was interfering with itself. And there's still all these theories, well, how could this be? But it's a known phenomena. Okay. So what Dean Radin did through the Institute of Noetic Sciences is he got a group of experienced meditators and then just a control group, people that didn't know anything about meditation, set up the two-slit experiment in another laboratory, told all the people in the experiment, we want you to concentrate on this experiment as if you can physically see, let's say, the slit on the left. And now they're sending the photons through just the slit on the right. And if they weren't doing this experiment and they sent the thing through the one on the right, you'd get the bands of light and dark. If there was an observer present, or if the second slit were closed, you'd get this disk of light. Or if you had any kind of measurement on the photon, even after it went through one of the slits, the interference pattern collapses. Okay, well known in physics. When the meditators concentrated on the slit on the left, even though they were just sending the thing through the one on the right, they got the disk. The interference pattern collapsed, even though they weren't physically present in the laboratory. The people that were not experienced meditators had no effect on this. Okay, so fasten your seatbelts the next notch, because here comes some more, even farther out. They asked the meditators to imagine that they could observe the photon after it went through one of the two slits. Not before, but after. And when they did that, the interference pattern collapsed. It had already gone through. They found in the research that there's now technology where the physicists can actually make a measurement to see which one it went through after it had already gone through, and it collapses the interference pattern. So the meditation that the people were doing was having an effect on something that had already happened. So it was changing something that happened in the past, and they're not physically present. So we assume, in fact, we don't think of it as an assumption. We think of this is the way reality is, that effects happen through time and space. You can't change something in the past. You certainly can't change something by sitting here and thinking about it. But this research, if you Google Institute of Noetic Sciences, there's a link on the site to this research. This was very well done, controlled research that shows that consciousness in and of itself is enough to collapse the quantum wave function. Okay, so our consciousness has an impact on the reality that we dwell in. And the usual way of talking about this in physics is, well, it collapses it. So instead of light behaving as either a wave or a particle, it forces it to behave as one or the other. So it's limiting down the space of how it can manifest. When the subtle realms are linked with the manifest realms, the opposite happens. It's actually opening up possibilities beyond what was present in the, quote, ordinary reality. So now instead of there being fewer possibilities, consciousness, through this linkage of the subtle and the manifest, has actually opened up a space of more possibilities than there were to start with. Now, I told you to fasten your seatbelts. So, to me this is very exciting. So, when we're doing what we consider spiritual practices, this is having this effect. It's linking the subtle to the manifest. But actually, when we're being much more fully present to our natural state of being, because our natural state of being is not a collapsed down perceptual framework that's limited to the physical senses or our concepts or emotional reactions to what we're experiencing, but our natural state is an opened up state of experience that allows a much richer reality. But we don't live in a very natural world. So the world is geared to texting on your phones and having 50 sources of input coming in all the time and reacting to this and that. So we're continually collapsing down what's possible. So we're not living in a space of freedom. Last time I talked about the adjacent possible. This is like what could happen next. Well, when we're in a typical state of consciousness, the adjacent possible is very narrow. And this can lead to pessimism, depression, because, what can you do? This is all that's on the table. But we're in this much more natural state of being. Now there's many more possibilities that can happen in the world that we're in. Okay, so let me pause here. Yes?
Sorry, the preacher again. And you heard something a couple of weeks ago that made me want to say this as well. I think what's fascinating is that what you're describing, and the manner in which you're describing it, in much of the traditional Christian language, has already been described, but then I think many, at least in my own world, I've been quick to kind of question the veracity of it, and it's described as this: the power of intercessory prayer, the power of healing, the power of laying hands on one another for healing. The church, for not just the church, but people of faith for eons have been trying to figure out what happens. We line up energy and prayer for one another's well-being, and then sometimes things happen that don't seem to have a description that satisfies. And that's similar to what I'm hearing you describe.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned prayer, because there was a study done many years ago where there was a group of heart patients who were in the hospital, and they randomly assigned them to different kinds of experienced healers, and some of them were assigned to, and the people were told, pray for this person. They didn't give them any information about them, gave them their name. And the ones that were prayed for, compared to the ones that didn't have anyone praying, had much better outcomes, shorter hospital stays, and so on. So there's clear evidence that there's an effect of healing at a distance. And I think I mentioned in an earlier class there was one study done where people were given the names of people who had been in the hospital in the past and asked to pray for them. And they weren't told anything about them, but it turns out the ones that were prayed for, it could have been 2 years after they got out of the hospital, when they looked to see what happened, had better outcomes than the ones that weren't prayed for. Well, how can you change something that already happened? Well, this itty-bitty photon gets changed with its information by a meditator sitting in another room. Human beings have lots of photons. You direct them one way. Yes?
So don't worry if you forgot to pray for someone.
The prayers still reach them in the next life. So. Okay. Well, just a second, other research that's been done, and this has been going on for decades, because I've been interested in subtle energy for a very long time, where they would take someone's DNA and put it in another room, and then they would show the person pictures that would be stressful, and there were changes in the DNA in another room from them looking at these pictures, and the DNA could be in a Faraday cage, which shields from every known form of electromagnetic energy. So I think most people probably think of healing as you're sitting here and you're sending them some energy. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's one way of relating to it. But if we're so totally interconnected, it doesn't have to go from any place to any place. It's already connected. And furthermore, I really believe this, what really happens in the most powerful kinds of healing is not a transmission of energy from one person to another person, but what's happening is there's a linkage between the consciousness of those two people such that the person who is receiving the healing is able to access an information field, not an energy field, but an information field that contains the restored structure of their being. And when they come in alignment with that information field, then that helps to bring changes down to even the manifest level to bring about physical healing or mental healing or emotional healing or whatever it is. So think about that for a second. It's each of us has that capability in and of ourselves, but sometimes it's harder to think that we can do that, but if there's somebody else we think is really good at it, it's easier to go, well, they're going to help me get healed. But really what I think is happening is we're accessing an information field that's coming from the deeper reality of our being, and it's bringing about this linkage of the subtle and the manifest in ourselves and bringing about the healing that we seek. And you had a question, Ruth.
Well, I remember reading that material you discussed about those experiments with meditators and with prayer and everything else, and there was one further statement about self-healing and the possibility that, for instance, people who are bedridden for months, like broken neck or whatever, and suffer from bed sores, could actually levitate themselves to avoid having bed sores. Did you?
I haven't read anything about that.
Well, it was in the field. That's where I read all that other.
Okay, I think that would probably be more challenging to do. I mean, seriously.
Well, you just said, though, that we all have this, we possess this, and it's just a matter of harnessing the right state of energy or field or whatever you're calling it. It's just a matter of accessing.
Well, I agree with your statement, and I think that some kinds of phenomena to bring about would be, there's stories of yogis in the Himalayas that not only can levitate but appear in different places at the same time. And I think that that would be in the postgraduate realm of things. But let me go on. It's a good question, though. Okay, so I'm going to say a little more about Laszlo, who has been twice nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And these are something from this book about the self-actualizing cosmos. He presents recent scientific evidence for the cosmos being an integral system actualizing in the interaction of two dimensions, an unobservable deep dimension, which I call the transcendent or the subtle, and an observable manifest dimension. Each of these two dimensions acts on and alters the other. Now, this is a big difference from traditional ways of looking at spirituality. It's usually there's the divine dimension and the manifestation. And manifestation can be changed by the divine, but we don't think about what we consider the divine dimension being changed by the manifest. But absolutely, I believe that happens. It's a two-way thing. Together, these two dimensions result in a universe that's always evolving. Non-locality, which means effects are not happening through time and space, is a basic feature of this new, for science, paradigm. This refers to interactions between parts of the whole transcending the known limits of effects propagating in space and time. So I want to talk about another person named Amit Goswami, who's a theoretical physicist. He's got another really wonderful book called Quantum Creativity. He says manifest matter is preceded by quantum possibilities or potentialities, and there are two realms of reality, potentiality and actuality. Creativity is described as a phenomena of consciousness discontinuously manifesting truly new possibilities from transcendent potentialities. In ancient traditions, creativity is referred to as a marriage between transcendent heaven and immanent earth. Creativity is the invention or discovery of new meaning invented or discovered using old or new archetypal contexts and combinations thereof. Quantum creativity enables insight into approaching problems that seem insurmountable from our usual state of consciousness. Okay. And previously I've talked about other research about influences that can't be accounted for by traditional physics. People in different rooms, brain waves get synchronized with each other, even when one's in the Faraday cage, which blocks all known electromagnetic energy. I've talked about the random number generators deviating significantly from randomness during events such as the Super Bowl or during traumatic events such as 9/11. So this is me talking here now. In some ways, we're similar to someone being given the latest type of computer, but only knowing how to check email and doing word processing. Sometimes not even that. We have tremendous latent capacities, and there are many tried and true methodologies for expanding the scope of experiences of our consciousness. If our explorations are motivated by a desire to make this a better world to live in, then we will become much more capable, both as individuals and as a community, of furthering the direct experience of a transcending mystery and wonder that every culture has affirmed, which renews our spirit and opens us to higher kinds of forces and helps us to awaken in life. That the Sufis say is the purpose of spirituality. Whatever belief system you have, it's to awaken to our divinity in life, and that means more than just realizing everything is God or we are a manifestation of God. A term that came to me yesterday, I mentioned to Diane, yes, there is worshiping of God, but what if we start thinking about participating in God, but God not being something up there? We are God's experience in the world, and we are capable of actively participating in the furthering of the awakening of wisdom in the world, and not only the unique wisdom that each of us has access to, but when two people or more than two people get together and there's the light upon light of each person's wisdom, now a third presence arises, and now there's a wisdom that's possible that couldn't occur from either person separately. And there's no end to it. And I've mentioned this before. I used to think about the Buddha and the Buddha's enlightenment. And it said the Buddha attained full, total, and complete enlightenment. Can't get any better than that. Well, Gautama Buddha can't get any better than that, but Buddha's enlightenment, what's possible for the Buddha to know, is different from what's possible for each person to know. And there's certainly overlap there, because, I mean, we have a common history and so on. And I mentioned this before, Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi mystic, said that God instructed the Prophet Muhammad to learn from his followers, and this is an amazing concept I haven't seen anywhere else in Islam, because God told Muhammad that each of his followers had access to a kind of wisdom that even the Prophet Muhammad couldn't have access to. So basically the same idea. Well, to me, this is tremendously exciting. There's not only no end to what each of us can discover in our own unfoldment, there's not any end to what can be unfolded through the interactions or the collective energies of people working together. And back to this idea of influences at a distance, there's been studies to show that when there's a group of people meditating together, there's a synchronization of brain waves in the group. And this is just a crude physiological measure, but it's basically a scientific explanation for why, something that I think most of us probably have experienced. Especially if you're not very far along in your meditation and you join a group of experienced meditators, it's much, much easier to get into the meditation. And then you probably have some frustration because you try to do practices on your own. And, I can't focus this way. Well, it takes a lot of time and development, but that's why there's a field created by a group meditating together. And they don't have to be physically in the same room, and they don't even have to be meditating at the same time, because that's another... the one about effects in space instantly, I think that's easier to swallow for most of us than effects across time. And that's not only the present affecting the past, it's about the future affecting the present. Okay, so let me pause here again and see. And by the way, all of these classes, once they're done, I've been recording them, and I'm going to send out a link, which hopefully can get on the church website as well. But I'll send it to everybody who's given their email that's been at this class, where you can listen to the recordings of all the classes. And you can pause and so on. And eventually, if I can figure out how to do it, I want to put these on as a podcast series on iTunes, available for free, but I've got to figure out how to do that. And if anybody's done that before, I'll be glad to get some technical assistance. But anyway, any questions right here? Oh, good. You've understood everything. Okay. Back to the role. I started this off with what drives the desire for greater wisdom. So let's think about the role of desire in manifestation. I talked last time about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basically survival needs, and then the highest one in the hierarchy is desire for self-actualization. The desire of humans, ever since there was a capability of self-awareness, has been to understand their relation to a larger reality, a desire to understand. So the desire for awakening is an inherent human property, which results in an increasing capacity to understand and be engaged in a more fulfilling modality of relationship to others, to the totality, and to God. And some time ago, this thought occurred to me that the scriptures historically, if you look at them, they all have wonderful wisdom in them, but they've changed. The content and the message has changed. And I thought of the scriptures, one way you could think about them as being God's continuing dialogue or blog, basically, with humanity, and vice versa, because the people that wrote the scriptures could only write as much as they were A, able to understand, and B, able to convey in a language that people could relate to. Because anyone who's ever had a profound mystical experience, it's beyond all words. But you can talk at it or about it. You could express it through poetry or art or music and so on, but you can't capture the whole thing. So the scriptures have been the best attempt of great beings over the centuries to elucidate their experiences, and their understanding was tempered by the whole theme of this class. What was the worldview and knowledge of the universe that they lived in? And so if you look at the ways beings have talked about the relationship of the transcendent, it's changed from the Greeks with their static archetypes and so on, to the notion that everything revolved around the earth and so on, to the time of Newton, and this one's persisted well into the present, that we live in a clockwork universe where there's driven by cause and effect and it's dualistic, to now quantum physics has been around for more than 100 years, but it'll probably take another 100 years at least for this to become, the realities of this to become part of the usual way of thinking of people. Right now it's something just very far out. Okay. So, a little poem here. This is Jalaluddin Rumi. It's called The Worm's Waking. This is how a human being can change. There is a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up. Call it grace, whatever. Something wakes him and he is no longer a worm. He is the entire vineyard and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. So maybe we can think of ourselves as emerging butterflies. It sounds better than worms waking. Now I want to talk about uniqueness. Anything in a particular quantum state is unique. So this is something I just read about the other day. I'd seen before, but I'd forgotten about it. So if you have, well, this part you may be familiar with. It's called entanglement. So if you have two particles that are entangled, so let's say one has an up spin and the other has a down spin, you can separate them to any finite distance, and there's means to flip the spin on one of them. Well, the spin on the other one instantly changes. There's no time that takes place. So that's pretty far out. There are some very, very, very distant galaxies, and there's a phenomena called gravitational lensing, where the light of a star gets bent and it comes out doubled. So, and part of it comes out this way and part of it comes out this way. But there's one where they had measurements on where, for reasons beyond my understanding, the light from one side, the photons coming from that star all were emitted at once. But the gravitational lens makes them seem as like half is coming from here and half is coming from there. And so what happened is that the light that came from one side arrived at Earth 50,000 years after the light from the other side. Well, they did experiments and they found out that these photons were entangled with each other, and they could change one and it would flip the other, even though the photons got shot out, so to speak, 50,000 years apart. So there was a phenomena that took place across 50,000 years of time. Well, if that's not amazing enough, they can make a particle in a certain quantum state, destroy it, later make another particle with the same quantum state, and they found out that the new one that they made, even though the first one was already destroyed, was entangled with the first one. That didn't even exist when the second one was created. Okay, let that one sink in a bit. You might let yourself ponder about, well, there's many people that have had experiences of connection with loved ones that have gone on. How is that possible? You know, are you kind of zapping your brain energy up to some other dimension someplace and something gets zapped back on a really good broadband service? Well, if in fact, as the physicists are saying, as well as the mystics, but I'll start with the physicists, that there's something called the quantum vacuum. It's called by other names the zero-point field, and it's that from which existence or matter arises. There's this continual dance of virtual particles coming into and out of existence, but sometimes something happens in this quantum vacuum that results in what has been called the Big Bang, where there's a change in the energy state of the vacuum that frees up all this energy. If in fact that exists, And Laszlo theorizes that this quantum vacuum contains the information from everything, but it isn't like you can get into the quantum vacuum and in the quantum vacuum look around at everything, but it's accessible potentially by beings in some form of manifestation that can tap into this. Well, different beings, we'll start with different beings who have existed at different times. All of the information of those beings is forever stored in this quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum isn't in time or space or even space-time. Space-time is something, and these are just mind-boggling things because we think of, well, what was there before there was the Big Bang? Well, there was just empty space. No, there wasn't any empty space. There wasn't anything you can talk about. And it wasn't that space was created in the Big Bang. Space-time was created in the Big Bang. So you can read little Einstein if you want to learn some more about this. But, I mean, our usual ways of thinking about even the vast reality that we live in are probably not accurate. And when you read some things that are at least written in a way that's understandable enough to follow, it's like, wow. I mean, I mentioned this before. There's been articles in Scientific American saying that time is just an illusion of our limited perception of a much deeper reality. Or one current theory, and anybody going to hear Brian Greene on Tuesday will probably hear about this one, that the universe that we live in physically and mathematically is indistinguishable between what we think it is and a holographic projection from a 5-dimensional reality projected onto a 4-dimensional screen, so to speak. There's no way to tell the difference. Is it real or is it Memorex? I mean, they're basically synonymous. William Tiller, who I've mentioned, who's done all the research on subtle energy, theorizes that human beings are really 10-dimensional beings and we're living in a simulation in physical reality to begin to understand the actual nature of who we really are and what our capacities are. We're awakening to those capacities. And these are heavy-duty, serious scientists saying this. These are not just kind of fly-by-night people going, well, this sounds like a nice thing, we'll just say that it's the case. So I'd like to read you a few goodies from the self-actualizing cosmos that got my attention. And what Laszlo calls this fundamental reality, the quantum vacuum, he calls it the Akasha. And some of you have heard of the idea of the Akashic records, which is usually thought of as like the great cosmic library where everything is, the information is stored. And Jonathan, back to your comment about omniscience, I mean, implied in that would be, well, all the knowledge of whatever has been, can be, and will be, God somehow knows. But to me, that's an impossibility because it's always being unfolded more and more. But there is always that which has been known so far that's being added to. So let's consider that being the Akasha. So this is quotes from this book. The Akasha is not merely one element among others. It is the fundamental element, ultimately the real dimension of the cosmos. It is what, in its subtle aspect, underlies all things, and in its gross aspect, becomes all things. In its subtle aspect, it cannot be perceived, but it can be observed in its gross aspect, which has become the things that arise and evolve in space and time. Now, this is Laszlo talking, and here's a quote from the Upanishads, which were written thousands of years ago, Hindu scriptures. All beings arise from space, and into space they return. Space is indeed their beginning, and space is their final end. And probably the term for space is not space. It's probably something like Akasha in the Sanskrit. What we experience, this is David Bohm, who was a physicist, what we experience through the senses as empty space is the ground for the existence of everything, including ourselves. The things that appear to our senses are derivative forms, and their true meaning can be seen only when we consider the plenum in which they are generated and sustained, and into which they must ultimately vanish. So there's one goodie. Now what Laszlo calls these two sides of things, he calls the M dimension manifest and the A dimension the Akashic dimension. The M dimension and the A dimension are related over time as well as synchronically at any given point, over time and at any given point in time. The generated particles and systems of particles, everything you see and hear, all of that is linked with the Akashic dimension through bidirectional interactions, two-way interactions, not just one way. In one way, the Akashic dimension in-forms the particles and systems, and the other way, the informed particles and systems de-form the A dimension. And this next part will explain what that is about. The A dimension, the Akashic dimension, is not the eternal and immutable domain of Platonic forms, but a dynamic matrix progressively structured by interaction with the manifest dimension. So just put this into the hopper about the ways that you may have thought about God and this permanent, unchanging reality. And what does it mean, as I mentioned earlier, to participate in God? Well, that means we're in this ocean, and we're like the waves that arise in the ocean, but the wave is the ocean coming forth in the form of the wave, and everything is affecting everything else. What's in manifestation is having an impact crosswise in manifestation. What's in the transcendent is affecting everything in manifestation, but what's in manifestation is affecting everything in the transcendent. Yes?
Isn't that true that this is talk often about things like this, such as this, but in the context of things not having cause or effect?
Yes, and I don't know if you were here last week, but I talked about this. He was asking about physicists saying things not having cause and effect. Well, in quantum physics, they are talking about this, and in Buddhism, which I talked about last week, there's this principle called mutual or dependent co-arising. Nothing causes anything else, or everything is the cause of everything else. But our brains are conditioned, and this is back to the first class, to believe that we are in a dualistic, separated reality, and of course something has to be the cause of something else. Something happened now, it must have been caused by something in the past. And to me, these are, I'll explain what I mean by old here. Old ideas such as karma and samskara. Karma is the belief that we've got to kind of pay our dues for all that we've done in the past, the consequences of previous actions. And samskaras in yoga are the impressions that condition us, that keep us from really being free. Well, all of that is true as long as you're in the usual state of consciousness and perception where you believe yourself as this being existing at a certain place in physical time and space, and you're kind of at the mercy of all that's come before, and you can kind of work your way out of the maze. But once you awaken to the real nature of your being, that you are a being who exists in multiple levels of reality, and we continually have the capacity of bringing about this linkage of the subtle and the manifest to open up new possibilities, then you're no longer bound by this chain of conditioning. In Buddhism, it said that the purpose is to get off the wheel of being and becoming and to go beyond all that. Well, in Sufism, Pirbalaya described it as we want to free ourselves from being stuck. What Hazrat Khan, who brought Sufism to the West, says we want to free ourselves from being the machine and to become the engineer, to be able to participate in the divine programming, and at any instant, this is a Buddhist term, the sword of wisdom or prajna, we can free ourselves in the instant of time from the chain of causality. And a Sufi from hundreds of years ago said, oh man, if you knew that you are free, it's your thought of captivity that keeps you in chains. So we're only bound because it's a mass, personal, individual, and mass belief that this is the way reality is, and that's a very powerful force. Think of all the billions of minds thinking the same way, and it takes a lot of doing to wake up from that. You had a question?
It was, yeah, no.
Well, that's okay. Let me go on because I'd like to read you some more. Let me read some more from here and then see if we have time for some more questions.
I just relate this all to me, and I hear people like Arlene talk about how everything is dance. And dance doesn't have cause and effect, it just happens. And so in the same way, there's still a purpose somehow because the music's playing.
Well, yeah, you may say dance doesn't have cause and effect, but it's nice to have choreography too.
Yeah.
It's nice to have a creative inspiration about how you want the dance to be.
Can you just talk about like how the galaxy is changed in a way in their movements and it relates to me in the same way with that cosmic death and all that.
Okay, well, let me read some more passages here. This is from, again, the self-actualizing cosmos. Astronomical and astrophysical evidence leaves no doubt that the manifest dimension of the cosmos, the space-time of the universe, says, plural, that emerge in the multiverse, evolves over time. So this whole inconceivably vast system, vaster, much faster than our physical universe, is evolving over time. Okay. Now he talks about Brahman, which is kind of the Hindu notion of the same thing of this quantum vacuum. Brahman, though undifferentiated, is dynamic and creative. From its ultimate being comes the temporary becoming of things in the manifest world with their various attributes, functions, and relationships. The samsara of being to becoming and then of becoming to being is the lila, or play, of creation and dissolution. The absolute reality of Brahman and the derived reality of the manifest world form an interconnected whole. Brahman is the fundamental reality. The things that appear in the manifest world have secondary reality. Mistaking them for real is the illusion of Maya. And I would say there's certainly a reality to what's in manifestation, but assuming that that's all that there is, or that everything is formulated around that view, that's the illusion. In the Akashic cosmology, what he calls the A, or Akashic dimension, takes the place of Brahman. It is the ultimate reality of the cosmos. The universes that evolve and devolve in space and time are manifestations of the Akasha, the enduring matrix of the multiverse. They are the breathing in and the breathing out of Brahman, the inflation and deflation of the universe, created in and by the Akasha. But unlike the traditional way of looking at things in Hinduism, as I mentioned earlier, when the universes aren't there anymore, there's nothing lost from the essence of the wisdom or the information from those. Those become the seeds that further the evolution of other universes. So in this way, you could say that there's not only an evolution in what we experience as the reality in which we dwell, there has to be an evolution of what takes place, whatever you want to call it the Akasha, call it God, call it the quantum vacuum. There has to be an evolution in what takes place in that, because if that were static, for one, how could there be any evolution in any manifestation that comes from that? It would be impossible. Okay, so kind of let that sit for a second. And then he's talking about the experience of transpersonal psychiatrists and psychotherapists shows that in non-ordinary altered states of consciousness we can receive information from almost any part of the world and from almost any time. It appears that, at least in potential, we do have access to the complete and permanent record of all things in space and time, that we can read the entire Akashic record. Here, the timeless insights of spirituality converge with the latest findings of consciousness research. And here's how Laszlo summarized this. I, a conscious human being, am not limited to my body. I am a matter-like system in the manifest dimension of the world and a mind-like system in the Akasha dimension. As a matter-like system, I am my body and I am ephemeral. But as a mind-like system, I am my consciousness. I am part of the world's deep dimension. I am omnipresent and immortal. Well, I would say we're omnipresent to the extent we're connected with everything else, a non-local part of the infinite wholeness of the cosmos. This is the guy who's been nominated twice for the Nobel Prize saying this. So, what could be a better antidote to low self-esteem? I mean, seriously. And if you have low self-esteem, don't worry about it. You've got forever. And I believe in something that I term the optimization of light. I think if I was going to make a principle of the define a principle of the cosmos, it would be, and this is the multiverse I'm talking about, multiple levels of reality. Everything is moving towards the capacity for a greater expression of light. And I don't mean just brighter light like this, but light being the conveyor of everything that's possible to know and experience, and that includes all the wisdom that can possibly be known, and all the creativity that can be expressed. There's no end to that, and everything as a whole is moving towards a greater expression. And that doesn't mean in the local places in space and time, like things can look pretty depressing right now. You just look at the news every day. It doesn't mean there's not darker periods, but the whole tendency. I talked about chaos last time. And phenomena, the shattering and the reorganization to a higher level. That on the whole, it's always moving towards a greater expression or capacity for light. And Hazrat Inayat Khan, again, who brought Sufism to the West, said that not only that every soul will have its moment of awakening, its time of awakening, but he said, and this is pretty profound, this was written in the early 1920s, every atom will have its moment of awakening. That there's nothing that ever could be that won't come to the fullest capacity of its experience. But then I would add commentary to that. After that happens, that's not going to be the end of the show. Then the show is really just beginning of the possibilities of what can come after that. Imagine, just imagine an earth in which everyone was an awakened being and was totally conscious of their interconnection with everything else, and what they did affected everything else, and realized their divine purpose in life, what the world would be like. Well, it would look very, very different than it does right now. And the more people that work on themselves through doing whatever helps to fulfill your own spiritual journey, and there's so many different kinds of spiritual practices that can be done. But even more fundamental than that, I think it's just what our outlook is on ourselves and how we go about living our lives, and why fundamentally we do what we do, and what is it that we're trying to bring forth more of. And we all have our own unique pathways and passions to follow. Like Joseph Campbell said, to follow your bliss. But as we awaken, we realize that our bliss is not based on just this individual going on their own journey towards awakening or enlightenment. It's having I can't even think of the positive enough adjective, the blessing, the gift to be able to participate in. We are the participation of the divine being, literally discovering what's possible. So we will have one more next week, and thank you for coming.
I have a question. Can I say something?
Yeah.